Hi, and welcome back to our video series on the Apostle Paul. This is video number 2 out of a 4-part series which seeks to address the question, who is Paul? As we do a survey of the New Testament, it's important for us to understand some of the major players and some of the major characters, and indeed Paul is one of those who is very important. And so we want to try and address one more aspect of that today. Now, we have been using a list of 4 reasons why we should study the Apostle Paul and why we should know who he is and why he's so important as a part of this course. So let me put up for you now those 4 reasons why we're studying Paul. And let me say to you that this is not an exhaustive list. You could say a lot more about Paul. Volumes have been written about this great apostle. But for the purposes of our survey, these 4 points, these 4 reasons for studying him, will be very useful to us. Now, in the first video, after a general introduction to Paul, we recognized Paul as a persecutor. He started out as the Apostle Saul, and he persecuted Christians wherever he could find them. In video number 2, which we're doing right now, we recognize that Paul becomes a great apologetic for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We'll look at the life of Paul, and we'll see that his change in life argues for the reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Number 3, we study Paul because Paul was a prolific writer of the New Testament. We'll talk about that in the next video. And then we will conclude with our discussion of Paul as a great missionary in the church, going all over almost the known world at that time, trying to teach people the gospel of Jesus Christ. So you have the 4 points why we are studying the Apostle Paul in this course. Now, previously, we established Paul as a persecutor of the church in our prior video. And that is an important foundation to what we're going to talk about in this lesson at this moment. Paul was a virulent persecutor of the church, and you cannot study the New Testament without realizing that. Bearing in mind that he is first introduced to us as Saul in Acts 7 and verse 58, he is a man who is giving his approval to the execution of one of the early members of the church, and that is Stephen. There are a number of other passages which we'll give you for your consideration. Acts 8, 1 through 3 describes that Saul is making havoc of the church, creating chaos everywhere he goes. We also read of Paul's work in Acts 9, 1 through 2, and then again in verse 4. In Acts 11 and verse 19, talking about the Christians being scattered. In Acts chapter 22, verses 3 through 5, and then 22, 17 through 21. And then almost as a reminder to Timothy of who he was, the young preacher, 1 Timothy 1 and verse 13. And there are other passages as well. But one has to understand that there is no question that Paul was a great persecutor of the church in the beginning. But something changed, and that's really at the heart of this lesson today. Because when we read the story of Saul, who becomes Paul, we realize that this is a man who did not simply make a change, not a small adjustment in his life, but this is a man who made a 180-degree turnaround in his life, in his thinking, and in his way of life. And it was a change which would cost him much, but he made that change anyway. And we're going to conclude that the only way that this can be understood is if Paul really believed in the resurrected Jesus Christ. Now, the core of this video lecture is in Acts chapter 9. In Acts chapter 9, and I'll summarize it here, there are 4 main things that happen. Paul is en route to Damascus for the purpose of persecuting and imprisoning Christians. He thinks he's doing the right thing. He has authorization from the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem to go to Damascus and to arrest these people. Number 2, as Paul travels on the road to Damascus, he is suddenly surrounded by a brilliant, bright light, a blinding light, which does in fact take his vision. The Bible says that he could hear the voices of men, but no man could be seen. And number 3, and this is verified in verse 5 of chapter 9, Saul actually talks with Jesus Christ. And this is an important moment because in Paul's way of thinking, Jesus Christ was dead and in the tomb. He did not believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead, as others had said. He was not a believer until we get to Acts 9 and verse 5. And then Paul can no longer deny what he has now heard with his own ears. He is then told by Jesus to enter into the city, and there it would be told him what he must do. And that's exactly what the apostle did. Paul went into the city, and there he met with a man named Ananias, who was sent especially to teach him. And Ananias comes to Paul, and he works a great miracle on Paul. He causes his blindness to suddenly go away, thus confirming to Paul beyond any shadow of a doubt that what he was going to say was true and by the authority of God himself. Ananias tells him what he must do. Paul would say later that Ananias said to him, "And now, Saul, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins." And Paul did that. And then notice Acts 9 at verse 20, where the Bible says that Paul immediately proclaimed Jesus. This period of time, from the time Paul was blinded on the road to Damascus until he began to preach Jesus Christ, was but 3 days. What happened to make him have such a change in his life so that he goes on to be one of the greatest men in the Bible? Well, you cannot say that Paul did this to become wealthy. Paul was probably on the fast track to wealth. He was a Roman citizen by birth, and he was a Jew who was favored by the Jewish leadership. But when he went on the road as a preacher, wealth would escape him. That's not why he did it. It certainly was not because he wanted an easy way of life. Paul's life would be very difficult. In fact, in most cities where Paul would travel to, he would be persecuted, even at times stoned and left for dead. No, Paul's life would not get any easier. It was not because he wanted an improved quality of life or fame or fortune, for many people came to hate the apostle. They despised him and viewed him as being a traitor to his Jewish faith. Paul did not become a Christian because he wanted power and influence. The purity of Paul's life comes through in his writings and comes through in the writings of others who speak of him. Those are not the reasons that he changed. Remember, this change in his life that occurred at Damascus brought no improvement to him. It made his life worse, made him the target of beatings. He was arrested, and he would eventually be executed for what he believed. So if there's no other explanation for why Paul did what he did, then why did he do it? What could be the reason why a man who is rising in authority in Judaism, a man who was soon to be a leader among the Jewish people, why is it that Paul changed? What brought about this change? Well, I think Paul tells us that in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. There, Paul tells us of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he tells us how that Jesus appeared to a number of different people and then appeared to him last of all. Jesus, the risen Lord, appeared to Paul. There can be no other answer. Consider this. Paul is persecuting people because he thinks that they are unfaithful to Judaism. They have changed their faith. They believe, in Paul's reckoning, in this Jesus who is dead and buried. And while Paul has no doubt heard the rumors that Jesus was raised from the dead, he did not believe them. And so Paul continued to persecute the church. But then when he's traveling on the road to Damascus, something else happens. Paul hears and sees the evidence that Jesus is no longer in the tomb. He speaks to Jesus, Jesus speaks to him, and he sees the Lord. Paul needs no other explanation. He knows immediately that Jesus Christ is the Redeemer, that Jesus is the one that Israel had been looking for. There's no other reason that Paul became the person he became. And so when we say that Paul was an apologetic for Jesus Christ's resurrection, we simply mean that Paul is evidence of Jesus' resurrection. One of the reasons we study Paul is because Paul is an apologetic for the resurrection of Jesus Christ.